Yeah, so let's jump into it. There's a lot of topics I'd like to discuss, but the first thing is just this unfolding nightmare around the deportation issue to the El Salvadorian prison. I feel like first we should just kind of recap the issue because we've been watching this, but I think you've been following it a little bit closer than I have. What's going on with Kilmar Abrego Garcia?
Okay, so Kilmar Abrego Garcia is a El Salvadoran national uh, who came to the United States illegally in I'm now forgetting the year. Was it? I think he's been here about 7 years. Um, he lived in Maryland. He over time married an American citizen, had an American citizen child. He had been rounded up in 2019 by ICE um, for either, and this depends on which of two documents you look at, which are totally in contradiction with one another, either as part of a murder investigation or for loitering outside Home Depot. Unclear which one it was, but he was never charged with murder. So he's got no criminal record in the US or El Salvador. His story, according to his attorney, is that he had fled El Salvador because he was being extorted by Barrio 18, which is a very, very common thing in El Salvador. So he was fleeing the gangs rather than being a gang member himself. But when he was rounded up by ICE, he was the I don't know if it was ICE or if it was like local police, but some detective uh, claimed that according to a field report, a confidential informant had accused him of being a member of MS-13. Um, First, we don't know. This is like hearsay of hearsay because we don't know who the confidential informant is, and this is and then there's the detective. So this is two leaps away from what the government has, and the detective has since been suspended for some reason. I'm not sure what. Um, so, so it's just an allegation. But because he couldn't prove a negative in court, by like you did come up with evidence, character references and whatnot, saying no, I'm not a member of MS-13. I'm not sure how you are expected legally to prove a negative, but the court basically said, well, because we don't. Oh, by the way, there was the testimony of the confidential informant, and then the other piece of evidence against him was that he was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat. Um, so the court said, well, we don't want to take the Bulls hat too seriously because that would, that's pretty flimsy. But we can't discount what the confidential informant apparently says, and so therefore they basically did not lift the removal order. I believe is, but so he still had a removal order from ICE, but he was granted basically sanctuary status because the court deemed it to be credible. And by the way, it's very hard to prove in these hearings that these claims are credible. You have to have a lot of compelling evidence, but that it was credible that he would be in danger if he was returned to El Salvador, that he would be targeted by gangs. So, um, so that was the status quo until recently when ICE rounded him up, sent him off to, this is a guy who's fleeing gangs, and they sent him to the viper's nest of MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs in El Salvador. I think I believe that the government has testified that he's still alive, but that seems questionable. Um, and uh, and that's where we are. And then the latest, of course, everybody knows is that Trump won't send him back. He refuses to. Says that's outside of his authority, which is preposterous. Because all he has to do is ask Bukele, and Bukele at the same time saying the same thing. He's like, well, it's outside my authority too, because Bukele is like, I can't do it without Trump's permission. Trump's like, oh, I can't do it without Bukele's permission. But they're like sitting right next to each other. They could just agree right there. But so it's this stupid charade. But clearly, the issue is that neither of them wants to send back this guy who was mistakenly sent. Um, oh, that's the other thing, which is common knowledge. He was mistakenly sent, and the government even admits to that. That he wasn't supposed to be deported, but he was, and now they won't bring him back.
And what was the issue there, that they were going after someone else and they mistakenly nabbed him, or what exactly was going on?
They rounded up, I believe, 4 people at that Home Depot. I was kind of guessing when I said this to you, and so this is my caveat, is that this is my guess.
Uh-huh.
Guess is that the other three, or some among the other three, probably were gang members and probably were involved in a murder, because one of the pieces of paperwork says that he was rounded up on a murder investigation, but apparently he barely knew these guys. These are day laborers, right? They're guys who see each other every day, and they just go, "Hey, what's up?" Um, and I think probably he was in their proximity. He probably said, "Hey," and then was like standing next to them, and then they rounded those three up, and he was standing there, so they rounded him up too, and said it was part of a murder investigation. And they probably, and maybe they had real compelling evidence that some of these other three were gang members, but not him. He just got swept up in it. That's my guess of what happened. We'll see. I don't know if we'll ever find out.
It's interesting that this is happening in Upper Marlboro in Maryland. I grew up in Prince George's County, not far from where Garcia lived. When I was in college, I went to University of Maryland. There's just growing reports of MS-13 kind of infiltrating the county, and questions about why there wasn't a crackdown. Most of those folks concentrated in this one kind of community called Langley Park. And a friend of mine, years ago in the first Trump administration, a friend of mine who I'd grown up with, he was a Prince George's County police officer. He was patrolling Langley Park, and he had a lot of really crazy interactions with the Salvadorian and Honduran community there. It's almost all Central American. And around accusations of MS-13, there were MS-13 gang members there. There were people who were human trafficking and engaging in, I guess, other, you know, gang-related activities. And then there were also people that were just absolutely suffering. I remember he told me an anecdote, and this was a long time ago. This was maybe 2017, where he went to an apartment that was allegedly MS-13, but it was just like almost a dozen men crowded into like a dormitory style situation, living in complete filth. People were miserable there. It was, these folks had come into the country without documentation. They're illegal. They're living in a very shitty situation. He would respond to calls all the time that were not really, what you would kind of count as some kind of organized gang activity. There was a lot of just like human misery stories out of extreme poverty. He said once that he responded to a call from a guy in Langley Park, and he was drunk, and he was like weeping, and he said, "Just deport me. I have nothing here. I can't find a job. I'm miserable. You can say I'm MS-13 if you want. I just hate it here in this country. I can't get by." He was like just in absolute squalor. And I remember at the time thinking like, wow, just like the human complexity of the situation that some people go through living in a community like this. Some people, some of those MS-13 people were engaged in heinous crimes and violence, um, but a lot of others who just kind of got stuck in the mix,
Yeah.
were just, really suffering and having working very difficult jobs, or living in extreme poverty. So that's neither here nor there necessarily, but kind of interesting that now that we have this quasi constitutional crisis, that it's going back to that same Salvadorian community in Prince George's County, Maryland.
Yeah, that actually brings to mind a couple of details that I left out. First of all, the accusation that that Kilmar was part of MS-13 was that he was part of a clique in Long.
Upstate New York, right?
I know, I think it was Long Island.
Okay.
Anyway, New York State, a state that he'd never lived in. And then the other thing is that yeah, people should bear in mind that in the United States, MS-13's main target population that they prey on are other undocumented immigrants, for the obvious reasons that, first of all, they have proximity to them, and then the second reason is because they know that they're vulnerable and probably won't go to the police. And the whole point of sanctuary city rules was to mitigate against exactly this problem. If you have a population of very vulnerable people, first of all, just criminals generally are going to gravitate towards victimizing them. And in today's day and age, it's going to, well, transnational gangs are going to be victimizing them. And so when the police do investigations and they try to figure out who's robbing or murdering these immigrants, or trying to figure out who's MS-13, they can't get any cooperation from anybody if they don't have sanctuary protections, because everybody's afraid that they're going to be deported if they cooperate with the police. So that's the whole purpose of having the sanctuary policies in the first place, is actually to make it more effective for law enforcement to be able to catch criminals, but specifically to catch transnational gang members like MS-13 and Bar U18. And then the other detail I forgot is that Kilmar's brother Cesar there was an attempt to forcibly recruit him into Barrio 18, and he fled El Salvador because they were trying to force him into it. So the other thing is, like, kids will get forced into the gang and then try to escape the gang and then be accused of having gang affiliations because of a brief tenure in which they were forced into the gang. So it gets murky. To your point.
I don't, maybe we should have someone on with a kind of legal background, but I just don't know where it goes from here, because district court judge basically ruled that because Garcia had received this kind of quasi asylum protection, he was not to be deported, um, that the U.S. needed to effectuate and facilitate his return after he was mistakenly taken out of this country, deported, and sent to this maximum security gang prison in El Salvador. And then the Supreme Court, in an unsigned opinion, said that they took half of that district court ruling and affirmed it. They said that the return has to be facilitated by the U.S. government, but not necessarily effectuated. Um,
Right.
and I'm definitely not qualified to parse the differences in terminology, but what I understand is that generally the Supreme Court was saying that the U.S. should help bring him back, but they did not have to immediately do so, and it was perhaps done with the understanding that the Trump administration would simply acknowledge what they had already admitted in court, that they had made a mistake, and that they would go about, in due course, bringing him back. But now with Trump, very kind of clearly asserting that he will do no such thing, and now his kind of partisans on Twitter are just like flooding social media, showing that 2019 um, arrest record with that confidential informant, saying, "Oh no, look, we know he's MS-13. There's no reason to bring him back." That leaves us at, I don't know if it's a crisis. What does that leave us at? What's your take on this?
I think it leaves us with a crisis. Those in terms of my interpretation of the effectuate versus facilitate thing is that it is kind of ironic, because I think the Supreme Court was actually trying to be very deferential to the executive, not get into any separation of powers problems, where the perception is that the courts are ordering the executive to do something or other, which gets into thorny constitutional territory. Effectuate, to me, in just plain English, means cause it to actually happen. So it's saying
Right.
you have to bring him back, whereas facilitate means you got to try to bring him back. So I think that was the legal kind of nuance that they were trying to navigate. Um, but I say it's ironic because in their effort to give deference to the executive branch interpreted in such a way to give absolutely preposterously minimal deference to the courts by saying, I believe that they made public statements saying that their job was that if Bukele chose to release him, then they would provide a plane to fly him back to the United States. And that was their interpretation to facilitate, as opposed to ask Bukele to return him. Like, that's really what we're talking about. Like, and by the way, JD Vance did this tweet where he was like,
And you got into it
I got
with
it.
JD Vance this morning. You should talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a tweet that our friend Zed responded to, and then I responded to, and Vance responded to both Zed and to me, and then other people jumped into it. And at one point, in that thread, I think it was in that thread, he said, he was like responding to somebody, and he said, "What do you want us to do? Send special forces into El Salvador and like liberate him from this prison?" Which is just so dishonest on its face. It's like, no, we expect you to ask Bukele to release him. Like that's like, there's no. Let's not just jump to the. They're just jumping to this conclusion that Bukele is totally against releasing them, when obviously he's just doing it because he's doing a favor for Trump and he's being paid to do it, for Trump. And if Trump asked to release him, then he would release him. So I think that it's transparently obvious what's happening. They have this fig leaf of an excuse to say that they're actually not violating the court order, but it's so obvious to everybody that they are openly defying the court order that it feels like we are in a constitutional crisis, in my opinion, because like, what is the court going to do? Is the court then going to play along and like we're all going to pretend that we believe this lie? Like, is the court going to basically back down in this game of chicken and say, okay, well, yeah, you did interpret what we were saying, but by our saying facilitate, that is what we meant, and just in order to not create a constitutional crisis, that would create a constitutional crisis anyway, in my opinion, because nobody would believe it. It would like cost so much legitimacy for the court. Everybody would know what's happening, which is that the executive is just steamrolling over the judiciary. On the other hand, if the judiciary says, screw you, like we meant it, you need to do it, then the only thing that saves us from a constitutional crisis is if Trump backs down. That doesn't seem likely.
Yeah, he's really just on a roll where every week it's kind of an extreme, unprecedented action. And especially on these kind of speech and due process issues, he's really quickly testing the boundaries of what is acceptable, where his limits are, where he might provoke an elite backlash or backlash in the markets or backlash from the courts. I mean, just about an hour before we started this, he was leaked that he's threatening to revoke the tax exempt status, the nonprofit status of Harvard University, out of some type of threat to force it into compliance with the demands that kind of do these contradictory things where they have no ideological litmus tests for their um, faculty, which is great in theory, but then at the same time they have to screen people for then a litany of ideological tests, such as the IHRA. Whether you've criticized Israel or engaged in supposed double standards related to Israel, or you have anti-Semitic or even anti-American beliefs. Which how do you define that? What I would consider an anti-American belief, others might consider a patriotic belief. It's these subjective terms that are complete bullshit, and they're forcing this down the throat of Harvard, and uh, you know potentially revoking the tax status. You know, again, I don't know the legal recourse for Harvard here. I saw people on Twitter. There are some criminal and civil codes around the executive politicizing the tax status, or using tax inquiries in a politicized matter. That's illegal, but I'm not sure for nonprofits. Uh, and just the general kind of nabbing people off the streets for op-eds critical of Israel. The last just month of actions from this administration feel so extreme, such a violation of basic concepts around free expression, due process, equality under the law. It's just hit everyone like a whirlwind. You're seeing kind of, I think, a rapid shift in some pundit opinions. I in some ways kind of sat out the election last year. I wrote critical pieces of both Trump and Kamala,
Mm.
but generally speaking, I kind of uh, I have more passionate opinions. I did not have a strong opinion for the election last year. I kind of saw the benefits in both sides. I saw huge drawbacks on both sides. Um, but now I think I'm not alone in folks who were disenchanted over the last 5 or 6 years from the progressive movement, who have lurched a little bit more to the center or to the right, now viewing the last month or so of actions, feeling quite frankly disturbed,
Yeah.
um, you know, uh, freaked out.
Yeah. I want to actually, this is what I want to get into, because I want to take sort of a reality check here, because like you know, we come from the same place of having been very critical of the excesses of the left over the last few years, and one of those excesses was just this constant hyperventilating and hysteria during Trump's first term, that we were on the brink of, you know, fascist takeover, that this was Weimar Germany in 1939, and I think, frankly, there were some people who kind of reveled in the romance of that, of believing that to be the case. It gave their lives meaning, and it was silly and it was cosplaying. And so, like, at this, so, you know, part of me is like, I'm very conscious of like not wanting to make that mistake, and not wanting to interpret what's happening now as, oh, actually this is the real deal, like we really are on the precipice of potentially losing our democratic rights, or if that's a realistic assessment of the situation. And I tend towards thinking it's actually a realistic assessment of the situation. What do you think?
Well, you know, I've made this argument before, and I think it's important to just lay it out here. The reason people, like the mass public, embraces fascism or something of that ilk is a response to extreme material conditions. Like, people joined the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia because the U.S. had illegally bombed Cambodia for the previous 5 or 6 years, killing over 100,000 people in this illegal secret war. And people were fed up with a government who didn't stand up for their rights, and they shifted to this extreme communist cult, this
Mhm.
death cult, the Khmer Rouge. Same thing for ISIS. You know, you have you had people in northern Iraq who were completely disenfranchised from the Shiite dominated government, these Sunni tribesmen in the north who were shut out of jobs, who were persecuted, who were uh, constantly being attacked by their own government. And so, okay, well, without any options for more democratic, pluralistic governance, okay, here's this radical group coming out of Syria. Let's all en masse join
Right.
ISIS. You know, it came out of something. And the same thing for Germany, too. You know, after like 1 out of 10 Germans were killed or seriously wounded at a World War I, and then you have a Treaty of Versailles that handicaps the entire country. And then after that, not only after this kind of miserable defeat in the Great War, you have Belgium and France and the other powers coming to collect on the kind of the war debt, the war reparations, and they invade Germany on multiple occasions and force the closure of Germany's largest industries and force Germany into this kind of contrived, arbitrary second round of economic depression. Then yeah, people start gravitating towards fascism. And
Yeah.
so we don't have that here in the U.S. But I just kind of I am kind of in fear of the moment that maybe we did have a material condition that made people more extreme, right? Like, if we had, you know, I don't think we're going to suffer through a military occupation anytime soon, but if we had extreme conditions and extreme depression, extreme economic turmoil, you know, some kind of much more deadly gene edited virus pandemic, some kind of chaotic moment, uh, you know, that's the kind of, and we had these kind of material conditions where people were desperate for strong governance, and they saw it, they saw nothing from traditional civic society. Then yeah, it is actually kind of terrifying that not only do we have uh, a very large number of politicians with authoritarian tendencies or tendencies to fall in line with an authoritarian leader, and we have like a media environment where people are so divided and hateful of each other that, you know, it's you know, there's a version of this that really turned me off, and I think turned you off, from wokeness and from leftism. And that, you know, I remember I had conversations 10 years ago with other progressives, people who worked in the Democratic Party, people who worked in the left wing kind of activist NGO world, and you know that they were just filled with contempt around white people, and they saw any kind of uh, effort to help the Midwest or parts of the South as, you know, somehow giving in to white supremacy, and just this kind of contempt for their fellow Americans. And it just it really disgusted me. And now I see that same type of visceral hatred towards other Americans coming from the right. You know, if you if you were a Democrat or you were a progressive or you lived in kind of the bubbles like we do, like in the Bay Area, I see this contempt on social media, this kind of visceral anger that is very dehumanizing. And that if we had kind of the right conditions, whether it's like another 9/11 or another or some other kind of chaotic uh, experience, I don't know. I feel like I'm for the very first time in my adult life, I'm feeling the conditions are a little bit scary because it's kind of there's a fertile field for hatred of our fellow Americans right now.
There's two things that make me particularly nervous, and one of them is what's happening um, on the right, and one of them is what's happening among just kind of mainstream liberals. And on the right, the thing that scares me, and this is like, granted, this is like a lot of my evidence base here is just like arguments on social media, and as I was saying to you the other day when we were together, it's hard to tell the difference between it's hard to know whether social media is detached from reality or if it's actually like a pronounced representation of reality. But the degree to which in their tribal sort of instinct to defend Trump and to celebrate Trump, people are so easily jettisoning just principles around things as fundamental as due process. And so there's like this norm deterioration that's happening where you can see it in front of your eyes, where people are like, well, why should illegals get due process? And then they're like, well, why should green card holders get due process? They're like, they're guests here. And I'm like, well, why should murderers get due process either? Like, American citizen murderers, why should they get due process? Everybody understands why they should get due process. It's to protect everybody else from just being accused of being a murderer and being thrown in prison without trial. Same holds for people who are not here legally, but you can see the slippery slope, which I know people call a fallacy, but often is true. You can just see it happening in real time, where these norms are kind of just evaporating, and people are ready to throw out things like like for example, hasn't got a lot of attention, but like Trump did an executive order for getting rid of birthright citizenship, and maybe it hasn't gotten a lot of attention because it's so preposterous and because everybody knows the courts will throw it right out. But like if this, once there is a court hearing on it, or once the court weighs in on it, and if he went to bat for this, then I could easily see people being like, well, why should it require legislative action? This is like totally within the purview of the presidency. So there's this like this very slippery kind of deterioration of norms that I'm seeing from the MAGA side. And then on the other side, I'm seeing this, I feel it myself, this just insecurity, this like, well, you're not sure if like, do we have First Amendment protections? We do on the books, that's for sure. Nobody's done anything to them, but will the government actually respect my First Amendment opinion or my First Amendment rights? Well, maybe there's a 2% chance that they won't. That the alarmists are right and that we don't have freedom of speech in this country anymore. If that thought is even crossing your mind before putting up a post on social media, maybe I won't say my opinion on social media just in case they're right. Or, you know, uh, if I have my legal rights, I'm going to exercise them. If it goes in front of a court, and like I feel totally confident in that because I know the law is on my side. But if you have this little just nagging doubt that, well, but is the Trump administration really going to respect a court decision? Like maybe the law's on my side, but if a judge issues a ruling, is that actually going to stop the government from taking action against me? Then you're going to retreat to just doing the safe thing. And I think that's exactly what's happening with like these university presidents and with these law firms, where they're just like, we don't know what this guy is capable of or what he's going to do. So even if we know that we're totally on legitimate ground in terms of our rights, our legal rights, we're going to just do the safe thing just in case those legal rights turn out to be a bad bet. And that to me is like, well, then you've already given up a huge amount of your democratic rights because you are already self censoring. You're already failing to fulfill, you're already afraid of exercising your legal rights. You're already submitting, you're already becoming a subject instead of a citizen.
When we were doing the Twitter files together and looking at the documents there and kind of piecing together, okay, well, here's this big social media platform and there's all these attempts to influence it. The most pernicious were, of course, from the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security. That's where there's the most kind of problematic influence. Of course, there are many other like interest groups, NGOs, other actors, political organizations attempting to influence it. But what kind of spun out of that series of investigations of the Missouri v. Biden lawsuit, which was actually filed before the Twitter files, but it kind of merged in terms of the issues, and it kind of people started looking at some of the same documents coming from both sources, was this issue of jawboning that, look, maybe and this was litigated at the Supreme Court, and this is what pretty much every Republican member of Congress, what folks who are concerned with the First Amendment and free expression had kind of embraced as a serious issue, was that the government simply nudging social media platforms and saying, hey, this piece of content, this tweet, this account is engaging in misinformation, disinformation. It's dangerous, and it's a nod, wink, wink that you should take it down. There were no explicit kind of demands that that content be censored. It was more like the government was sending a bat signal that every platform